I had always believed that trust was the foundation of any marriage. Sure, Jen and I had our ups and downs, but I never doubted her loyalty, not until that night. It was supposed to be a simple work dinner at the Wellington, a place known for its quiet corners and dim lighting. I was there to discuss a new business opportunity, but the conversation with my client quickly faded into the background when I spotted her. There, at a table by the window, sat Jennifer. By Jennifer, her head tilted slightly as she laughed at something her companion said. And that companion wasn't a friend from work or some old acquaintance. No, it was David Parker, the high-powered attorney who always seemed too slick for his own good. He leaned in closer, their hands briefly touching in a way that sent a chill down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. This was just a business meeting, I told myself, trying to quell the rising panic. But deep down, I knew. There was an intimacy between them that I couldn't explain away. I forced myself to stay calm, not wanting to create a scene. I returned to my own table, though I barely heard a word of what my client was saying. My mind was in overdrive, replaying that moment over and over. When I finally left the restaurant, I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly through the city, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But the images wouldn't leave me. Jennifer's smile, David's hand on hers. It all felt like a betrayal I couldn't bear to face. The next few days were a blur of confusion and denial. Every time Jennifer looked at me, every time she touched me, I wondered if I was just imagining things. But the doubts had taken root, and I couldn't shake them off. Jennifer was always busy with work, but suddenly, there were more late nights and more urgent meetings that she couldn't miss. She started keeping her phone closer, and when I asked her about it, she just smiled and told me I was being paranoid. "Mike, come on," she laughed one evening when I questioned her about another late night at the office. "You know how crazy work gets. I'm just trying to stay on top of things." I wanted to believe her, I really did. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. So, one night when she was in the shower, I did something I'd never done before. I checked her phone. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through her messages, and there it was, a conversation with David. It wasn't explicit, nothing that screamed affair, but there were enough hints to confirm my worst fears. Plans to meet up, jokes that seemed too personal, too familiar. I felt sick. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen, trying to process the reality of what was happening. Jennifer, the woman I loved, was cheating on me. And with David Parker, of all people. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I did what I always did when I didn't want to deal with my emotions. I buried myself in work. I started leaving early, staying late, anything to avoid coming home and facing the truth. But it wasn't enough. The pain didn't go away. And that's when I met George. My days became an endless cycle of work and avoidance. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, and every time I looked at Jennifer, the anger and betrayal churned inside me like a storm. I knew I had to do something, but I felt paralyzed, stuck in this miserable limbo. That was until I met George. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was at the gym, trying to burn off some of the frustration that had been building up. I wasn't looking to talk to anyone, I just wanted to be alone with my thoughts. But George had a way of getting through to people, even when they didn't want to be reached. I'd seen him around before, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with a serious look on his face. He always worked out with an intensity that matched my own, and that night was no different. After a while, he came over, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "Rough day?" he asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. I shrugged, not really in the mood to share. Something like that. He didn't press, just worked out alongside me for a bit. But after a while, we got to talking, first about workouts, then about life in general. Eventually, the conversation turned personal, and I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't expected. "I think my wife's cheating on me," I admitted, the words feeling heavy and foreign as they left my mouth. George didn't react with surprise or pity, just nodded thoughtfully. "I've been there," he said quietly. "It's like a punch to the gut. Hard to breathe, hard to think straight." I looked at him, surprised by how calmly he was talking about it. "How did you deal with it?" He let out a slow breath, his eyes narrowing slightly as he seemed to recall a painful memory. "I didn't, at first. It nearly destroyed me. But then I realized, sitting around and feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to fix anything. So, I came up with a plan." "A plan?" I echoed, not sure what he meant. He nodded, his expression hardening. Revenge, Mike. You got to hit back. You don't let them walk all over you. You take control. I wasn't sure if I was ready to go down that path, but the idea of doing something, anything, to take back some power was tempting. As George started talking about how he dealt with his own situation, I began to see the outlines of a plan forming in my own mind. You don't just want to catch them, George continued. You want to make sure they pay. And from what you've told me about this David guy, he's got a lot to lose. He was right. David Parker wasn't just some random guy. He was a prominent attorney with a reputation to protect. And if I could bring him down, maybe it would hurt Jennifer as much as she'd hurt me. By the end of our conversation, I knew I had to do something. George offered to help, and though I was hesitant at first, I finally agreed. Together, we would come up with a plan to expose David and make sure he, and Jennifer, paid for their betrayal. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. George was meticulous and his experience was invaluable. He'd been through this before. And he knew exactly what needed to be done to bring someone like David Parker to his knees. We started with surveillance. George had a friend who worked in private security, and he helped us get the equipment we needed. It felt strange at first, like something out of a spy movie, but I quickly adapted. I was too angry, too determined to let anything stand in my way. We began tracking David's movements and learning his habits, his routines. It didn't take long to find out that he was more than just an unfaithful man. He was a corrupt one. 2. George and I discovered that David was involved in some shady dealings at his firm, using his position to manipulate cases for his own benefit. This guy's not just a cheater, George said one night as we reviewed the evidence we'd gathered. He's dirty. We can use this to bring him down hard. I couldn't believe what we were uncovering. It was as if every stone we turned over revealed something worse about David. And the more we found, the more determined I became to see this through. But it wasn't just about David. The more we dug, the more I started to realize how much Jennifer was involved in his world. She wasn't just an innocent bystander, she was actively helping him, covering for him. It was a betrayal on a level one hadn't even imagined. One night, I managed to record a conversation between Jennifer and David. They were discussing one of his underhanded deals, laughing about how they were going to make a fortune. Hearing Jennifer's voice, so casual, so complicit in his schemes, made my blood boil. This is it, George said, playing back the recording. This is what we need. We take this to the right people, and David's career is over. And Jennifer, she won't come out of this unscathed either. I nodded, feeling a cold sense of satisfaction. We had them. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around them. But even as the plan started coming together, a part of me couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. This wasn't who I was. I wasn't a vengeful person by nature. But the pain of Jennifer's betrayal, the anger I felt every time I thought about her with David, was too strong to ignore. I had to see this through. For my own sanity, for my own sense of justice. I needed to take back control of my life, and if that meant destroying David Parker in the process, then so be it. With the evidence in hand, George and I began to strategize the best way to take down David Parker. It wasn't enough just to expose his affair with Jennifer, we wanted to destroy his entire career. Making sure he would never recover from the scandal. We knew we had to be careful and meticulous in our approach, and ensure that every move we made was calculated. The first step was finding someone who could help us get the evidence into the right hands. George suggested we contact a journalist he knew, someone who specialized in uncovering corruption and had a reputation for integrity. Her name was Rachel Matthews, and she had a knack for taking down powerful men who thought they were untouchable. We met with Rachel in a small, out-of-the-way cafe, far from prying eyes. She was sharp, no nonsense, and immediately intrigued by what we had to offer. You've got recordings, documents, and witnesses, she said, sifting through the materials we provided. This is explosive stuff. If what you're telling me is true, Parker's not just going to lose his career, he's going to lose everything. That's the idea, George said with a grim smile. Rachel nodded, already beginning to map out the story in her head. We need to verify everything, of course, but once we do, this will be front-page news. We'll hit him where it hurts the most, his reputation. For the next few days, we worked closely with Rachel, providing her with everything she needed to build a solid case against David. She was thorough, making sure every piece of evidence was airtight before moving forward. During this time, I avoided Jennifer as much as possible. She was still clueless about what was happening behind the scenes. Still going about her life as if nothing was wrong. Every time I saw her, every time she smiled at me or tried to act like the perfect wife, my anger only grew. Finally, Rachel was ready to publish the story. She'd verified everything, spoken with witnesses, and even managed to get a few incriminating quotes from people inside David's firm who were willing to turn against him. The article was set to go live the next morning, and we knew that once it did, David's world would implode. But before that, there was one more thing we needed to do. The night before the article was to be published, I decided it was time to confront Jennifer. I couldn't let her continue living in ignorance, pretending that everything was fine. She needed to know that I was aware of her betrayal and that the life she'd built with David was about to crumble. I waited for her to come home from work, sitting in the living room with a glass of whiskey in my hand. When she walked in, she smiled at me, the same smile that had once brought me so much comfort. But now only filled me with rage. "Hey, Mike," she said, setting down her bag. "You're home early. I thought we needed to talk," I replied, my voice cold and distant. She frowned, sensing the tension in the air. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "I know about you and David." Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. She knew she was caught, and there was no point in trying to deny it. "How long?" I asked, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. "How long have you been lying to me?" She looked down at the floor, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mike, I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" I cut her off, my voice rising. "You're sorry? After everything, that's all you have to say?" "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It just happened. I didn't plan for any of this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was acting as if this was just some minor mistake. Something that could be brushed off with an apology. But it wasn't that simple. "I trusted you, Jen. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me," I said, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. She tried to reach out to me, but I pulled away, not wanting her touch. "Please, Mike, let's talk about this. We can work through it." I shook my head, feeling a cold, hard resolve settle over me. "There's nothing to work through. It's over." Her tears flowed freely now, but I didn't care. I couldn't let her see the story that was about to break. I couldn't let her think for even a second that there was a way to salvage what we had. I needed her to understand that this was the end. "Tomorrow, you'll see just how wrong you've been," I said, standing up and walking to the door. "David Parker is finished, and you're going down with him." She looked at me in shock, finally realizing the full extent of what I was saying. "Mike, what have you done?" "I did what you forced me to do," I replied coldly. "Now, you'll have to live with the consequences." I walked out, leaving her standing there, broken and defeated. As I left the house, I didn't feel any satisfaction, just a hollow emptiness where my love for Jennifer used to be. Tomorrow would bring the reckoning, but tonight, I was done. Done with her, done with the lies, and done with the man who had ruined everything. The morning after my confrontation with Jennifer, the world as she knew it began to unravel. Rachel's article went live at dawn, and by the time I had my morning coffee, it was already making waves. The headline screamed across the internet, "High-profile attorney David Parker exposed, corruption, affairs, and the fall of a legal titan." The story was brutal, laying out every detail of David's corrupt dealings and his affair with Jennifer. Rachel had done her job well, too well, perhaps. The article didn't just expose David's professional misconduct, it painted a vivid picture of his personal life, dragging Jennifer's name through the mud alongside his. As I read through the piece, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and regret. I had wanted revenge, and now I had it, but the cost was higher than I had imagined. By mid-morning, the news had spread like wildfire. David's law firm issued a statement, distancing themselves from him and announcing an internal investigation. His clients began to pull out, and his once golden reputation was tarnished beyond repair. The legal community, always eager for scandal, turned on him with a ferocity I hadn't anticipated. There were talks of disbarment, of criminal charges. His entire life was crumbling before my eyes. As for Jennifer, she wasn't spared the public's wrath. Her name was mentioned in the article, and though she wasn't the main focus, it was enough to make her a target. Social media was merciless, with strangers tearing apart her character, calling her names, and blaming her for everything that had happened. I knew she would be devastated, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out to her. This was the price she had to pay for her betrayal. Still, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that maybe I had gone too far, that in my quest for revenge, I had destroyed more than just David Parker. By the afternoon, I received a text from George. "It's done. He's finished." I stared at the message for a long time, wondering if I should feel victorious. George and I had accomplished what we set out to do. David Parker was ruined. But as I sat there, the satisfaction I'd expected never came. Instead, I felt an overwhelming emptiness, a sense that I had lost something I could never get back. In the days that followed, the fallout from the article continued to spread. David's world had collapsed entirely, and he went into hiding, avoiding the press and the angry public. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, and his personal life in shambles. But the impact on Jennifer was even more devastating. She lost her job within days of the article's publication. Her boss claimed it was because of budget cuts. But we both knew the real reason. The scandal had made her a liability, and no one wanted to be associated with her. The same friends who had once admired her turned their backs, distancing themselves from the mess she had become entangled in. She tried reaching out to me several times, leaving tearful voicemails, pleading for a chance to talk. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. Every time I heard her voice, it reminded me of the betrayal, of the trust she had shattered. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. One evening, a week after the article had gone live, I found myself standing outside the apartment building where Jennifer was staying. She had moved out of our house the day after our confrontation, too ashamed or perhaps too guilty to stay. I had no intention of going in, but I needed to see her, to understand the full extent of what we had both lost. As I stood there, staring up at the dimly lit windows, I saw her silhouette move across the room. She looked small and fragile, like a shadow of the woman I had once loved. Seeing her like this, I felt a pang of guilt. I had wanted her to suffer, but now that she was, it didn't feel like justice. It felt like cruelty. I was about to turn and leave when my phone buzzed. It was another message from George. "You did the right thing." She deserved it, but did she? I couldn't be sure anymore. I'd spent so much time planning my revenge, focused so intently on bringing down David and punishing Jennifer, that I hadn't stopped to consider what I really wanted. Now that it was all over, I realized I didn't feel better. In fact, I felt worse, empty, lost, and unsure of what to do next. I left the building that night without speaking to Jennifer. I wasn't ready to face her, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if George had been right all along, if revenge was the only way to reclaim my life. But as the cold night air bit at my skin, I began to question whether the price of that revenge had been worth it. In the end, I had destroyed David Parker, and in the process, I had destroyed Jennifer too. But I had also destroyed a part of myself, something I wasn't sure I would ever be able to rebuild. Days turned into weeks, and the dust from the scandal finally began to settle. The headlines moved on to the next big story, and the world seemed to forget about David Parker and Jennifer, everyone except for me. I couldn't escape it, couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. At work, my colleagues noticed a change in me. I was more withdrawn, quieter, and less engaged. I threw myself into projects, trying to keep busy, but even that didn't provide the distraction I needed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jennifer's face, heard her pleading voice, and felt the weight of my own actions pressing down on me. George was the only one who didn't seem affected by what had happened. He would occasionally check in, asking how I was doing, but his tone was always the same, cold, detached, as if this had all been nothing more than a business transaction. I couldn't understand how he could be so indifferent, how he could move on so easily after what we had done. One evening, after another long day at work, I found myself sitting alone in my living room, staring at the empty walls. The house felt like a tomb, a place filled with memories I no longer wanted to confront. The silence was oppressive, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to think about the future, about what my life would look like without Jennifer. Without the anger that had driven me for so long. I had won, but what had I really gained? The satisfaction I had once craved had turned to ashes, leaving me with nothing but regret. I knew that I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a cycle of bitterness and self-loathing. Something had to change. The next day, I decided to do something I hadn't done in months. I took a day off work. I needed time to think, clear my head, and figure out what I wanted to do next. I packed a small bag, got in my car, and drove out of the city, heading toward the coast. There was a small, quiet beach I used to visit when I needed to escape, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts. When I arrived, I walked along the shoreline, the waves crashing against the rocks as the wind whipped through my hair. I felt a sense of peace here, something I hadn't felt in a long time. As I walked, I began to process everything that had happened, all the choices I had made, and the consequences that had followed. I thought about Jennifer, about the love we had once shared and how it had all gone so horribly wrong. I thought about David, about how he had become the target of my anger, and how I had allowed that anger to consume me. And I thought about George, about how easily he had convinced me that revenge was the answer. Standing there, looking out at the endless expanse of water, I realized that I had been wrong. Revenge hadn't brought me closure, it had only deepened the wound. I had let my pain drive me to a place I never should have gone. And now, I was paying the price. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it filled me with dread. It wouldn't be easy, but if I was ever going to move on, I needed to make amends. I needed to confront the damage I had caused and find a way to atone for my mistakes. With a heavy heart, I made the decision to return home and face what I had done. It was time to take responsibility, to stop running from the truth, and to start rebuilding my life, whatever that might look like. When I returned to the city, the first thing I did was reach out to Jennifer. I wasn't sure if she would want to see me, but I had to try. I sent her a message, asking if we could meet somewhere neutral, somewhere away from the painful memories of our past. To my surprise, she agreed. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a place neither of us had been to before. As I walked in, I saw her sitting by the window, staring out at the street with a distant, sad expression on her face. She looked thinner and more fragile than I remembered, and the guilt hit me like a wave. When she saw me, she managed a small, tentative smile, but there was no warmth in it, only a lingering hurt that I knew I had caused. I sat down across from her, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. "Thanks for meeting me," I said, breaking the silence. My voice felt rough and unfamiliar, as if I hadn't spoken in days. She nodded, her eyes searching mine for some sign of the man she had once loved. "I wasn't sure if I should, but I needed to hear what you had to say." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. "Jennifer, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything, for what I did, for how I handled things. I let my anger get the best of me, and I hurt you in ways I can't take back." She looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I hurt you too, Mike. I betrayed you, and I know there's no excuse for that. I've been trying to understand why I did what I did, but I don't know if I'll ever figure it out." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared pain hanging between us. Finally, I spoke again, my voice soft but firm. "I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. But I want you to know that I regret how things ended. I regret the choices I made." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I regret it too. I wish we could go back, but I know we can't." We talked for a while longer, sharing memories of better times, acknowledging the love that had once been there, and the mistakes that had led to its downfall. It was painful, but it was also necessary, like lancing a wound to let it heal. Before we parted, I handed her a small envelope. "I want you to have this," I said. "It's the evidence we used to bring down David. I don't know if it'll help, but maybe it'll give you some closure." She took the envelope, her expression unreadable. "What about you, Mike? What are you going to do now?" I thought about it for a moment, realizing that for the first time in months, I didn't have an answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think I need to figure out who I am without all this anger, without the need for revenge. I need to find a way to move on." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "We both do." We said our goodbyes, and as I walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and a glimmer of hope. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. I had sought revenge and found only emptiness. Now, it was time to seek redemption, to find a way to live with the choices I had made, and to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. After meeting with Jennifer, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if the conversation had lifted a weight off my shoulders, allowing me to see things more clearly. But clarity didn't mean closure. The guilt, regret, and pain were still there, lingering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to remind me of what I had done. I knew I couldn't heal overnight, but I also knew I couldn't keep wallowing in my mistakes. It was time to take the first steps toward rebuilding my life. But where to begin? The idea of moving on felt overwhelming, like trying to rebuild a house from scattered ashes. The first step, I decided, was to make amends with the person who had guided me down the path of revenge, George. I needed to understand his role in all of this, to confront the influence he had on me and why I had allowed it. I reached out to him, asking to meet, and he agreed without hesitation. We met at a bar downtown, the same one where we had first hatched our plan to bring down David Parker. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked in and spotted George sitting at a corner table, nursing a beer. He looked up as I approached, giving me that same cold, calculating smile that had once seemed so reassuring. "Mike," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "You're looking better. I take it you've had some time to think?" I sat down across from him, not returning the smile. "Yeah, I've been thinking a lot, actually. About what we did, about why we did it." George leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And, do you regret it?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I regret a lot of things, George. But mostly, I regret letting my anger consume me. I regret letting it destroy not just David and Jennifer, but a part of myself too." He shrugged, taking a sip of his beer. "You did what you had to do. They betrayed you, Mike. You were justified." "Was I?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. "Or did I just let you convince me that revenge was the only option? Maybe I was too angry, too hurt, to see that there were other ways to handle it." George's eyes narrowed, his smile fading. "You're blaming me?" "I'm blaming both of us," I replied, holding his gaze. "But mostly, I'm trying to figure out how I let this happen. How I let myself be manipulated into becoming someone I barely recognize." He scoffed, setting his glass down on the table. "Manipulated? Come on, Mike. You knew what you were doing. You wanted revenge just as much as I did." "Maybe," I admitted, "but that doesn't make it right." We sat in silence for a moment, the tension between us thickening. George looked at me with a mix of frustration and disbelief, as if he couldn't understand why I was having second thoughts. In his mind, we had won, end of story. But for me, the story wasn't over. "You know," I said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, about how revenge was the only way to take back control. But I'm starting to see that it wasn't about control at all. It was about letting go. And now, I had to figure out how to do that." George shook his head, clearly disappointed. "You sound like you're getting soft on me, Mike." "Maybe," I said, standing up. "But maybe it's time to stop being so hard." As I walked out of the bar, I didn't look back. I knew that my relationship with George had changed irreparably. And I wasn't sure if we could ever go back to the way things were. But I was okay with that. I had made my decision, and it was time to move forward, without the weight of George's influence dragging me down. With George behind me and Jennifer out of my life, I found myself facing the daunting task of rebuilding. The first thing I did was move out of the house we had shared. There were too many memories there, too many reminders of what had been lost. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, modest but comfortable, and began the slow process of starting over. I threw myself into my work, but this time, it wasn't about distraction. I started taking on projects that challenged me and forced me to think creatively and push my limits. It wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder anymore, it was about finding a sense of purpose, something that had been missing for far too long. I also began reconnecting with old friends, people I had lost touch with during the chaos of the past year. At first, it was awkward, explaining my absence, the vague details of what had happened. But slowly, I started to rebuild those relationships, finding comfort in the familiar, in the connections that had once brought me joy. But the most important step I took was seeking professional help. I had always been skeptical of therapy, seeing it as a sign of weakness, but I realized that I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone to help me navigate the complex emotions that had taken root inside me, someone who could guide me toward healing. My therapist, Dr. Carter, was patient and understanding. She didn't push me to talk about anything I wasn't ready to, but she encouraged me to explore my feelings, to confront the guilt and anger that still lingered. Through our sessions, I began to understand the depth of my pain, the ways in which I had let it control me, and the steps I needed to take to move past it. One day, during a session, She asked me a question that stuck with me long after I left her office. What do you want your life to look like? Mike? Not what it was before, but what it could be now. The question haunted me, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I realized I hadn't thought about it in a long time. I had been so focused on the past, on what had been taken from me, that I hadn't allowed myself to imagine a future that was different, better. That night, I sat in my new apartment, looking out at the city lights, and for the first time, I started to think about what I wanted. I wanted peace, real peace. Not just the absence of conflict. I wanted to find joy in the little things again, to wake up each day with a sense of purpose and direction. And maybe, one day, I wanted to love again, to find someone who could see past my scars and help me build something new. It wouldn't be easy, and I knew there would be setbacks along the way. But for the first time, I felt like I was on the right path. The anger that had once defined me was starting to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild, not just my life, but myself. As I sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized that this was the beginning of something new. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. I had the power to choose my future, to shape it into something that brought me happiness, fulfillment, and peace. And as I looked out at the city, I felt a sense of hope, a small, fragile thing, but real nonetheless. I had lost a lot, but I hadn't lost everything. There was still a chance for redemption, for healing, and for a new beginning. And this time, I wasn't going to let anything stand in my way. Months passed, and slowly but surely, my life began to take shape again. The wounds were still there, but they had started to heal, leaving behind scars that served as a reminder of what I had been through. My sessions with Dr. Carter helped me come to terms with my past, and I was making progress in letting go of the anger that had once consumed me. But just when I thought I was moving forward, an unexpected event threatened to pull me back into the darkness. One afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering, my instincts telling me that this wasn't going to be good news. When I finally picked up, a voice I hadn't heard in months came through the line. "Mike, it's Jennifer." I froze, the sound of her voice bringing back a flood of memories, both good and bad. I hadn't spoken to her since our last meeting at the cafe, and hearing from her now caught me off guard. "Jennifer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she finally spoke. I need your help." My heart sank. After everything that had happened, the last thing I expected was for Jennifer to reach out to me for help. But there was something in her voice, a sense of urgency, that made me listen. "It's David," she continued, her voice shaky. "He's been spiraling ever since the article came out. He's lost everything, his career, his reputation. And now, he's threatening to come after me." I felt a knot form in my stomach. David Parker had been the focus of my revenge, but I hadn't considered the full extent of what that would mean for Jennifer. She had been caught in the crossfire, and now she was paying the price. "What do you mean, come after you?" I asked, trying to keep the concern out of my voice. "He's been sending me messages and emails, threatening to expose everything about our affair and ruin what little I have left. I don't know what to do, Mike. I'm scared." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to distance myself from the situation, to tell Jennifer that she was on her own. But another part of me, the part that still cared for her, despite everything, knew that I couldn't just turn my back on her. "Where are you?" I asked. "I'm staying with a friend right now, but I don't feel safe here. He knows where I am, and I'm afraid he's going to show up." I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. "Okay, listen to me. I'm going to help you, but we need to be smart about this. We can't let him manipulate you any further." Jennifer agreed, her voice trembling with relief. We made plans for her to come to my apartment, where she would be safer, and we would figure out what to do next. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. When Jennifer arrived at my apartment later that evening, she looked like a shadow of the woman I once knew. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale, and she seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Seeing her like this stirred something inside me, an urge to protect her, to make things right. We sat down in the living room, and she began to explain everything that had happened since the article was published. David had gone into hiding, but he hadn't given up on his vendetta. He blamed Jennifer for his downfall, and now he was determined to take her down with him. "He's lost everything," Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. And now, he's coming after me because he has nothing left to lose. I listened carefully, trying to piece together a plan. I knew that going to the police was an option, but given the nature of their affair and the public scrutiny, it might only make things worse. We need to get ahead of this, I said, finally. We need to gather all the evidence we have, messages, emails, anything that shows he's threatening you. And we need to be ready to defend ourselves if he tries to make a move. Jennifer nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Mike. I don't know what I would have done without you. As we worked together to compile the evidence, I couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for what Jennifer was going through. My quest for revenge had set these events in motion, and now, I had to face the consequences. But I wasn't going to let David Parker win. Not this time. The following days were tense, filled with anxiety as we waited for David to make his move. Jennifer stayed at my apartment, and though the situation was far from ideal, it gave us both a sense of security, however temporary it might be. We kept our phones close, ready to document any new threats, and made sure the apartment was locked up tight every night. Then, one evening, the call came. It was late, and we were sitting in the living room, going over the evidence we had collected. Jennifer's phone buzzed on the table, and we both jumped. She picked it up, her hand shaking, and glanced at the screen. The color drained from her face. "It's him," she whispered. Without hesitation, I took the phone from her and answered it. "David," I said, keeping my voice calm. "What do you want?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low, menacing laugh. "Mike, I was hoping I'd get to talk to you. How's my favorite couple doing?" His voice sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Cut the crap, David. What do you want from Jennifer?" "What do I want?" He echoed, the mockery in his tone unmistakable. "I want justice. I want the world to know the truth about her, about how she ruined me." "You did that to yourself," I replied, my voice hardening. "Don't try to pin your downfall on her." David laughed again, but this time there was a hint of desperation in his voice. "You think you've won, don't you, Mike? You think you've got it all figured out. But you're wrong. I've still got cards to play." I tightened my grip on the phone, anger simmering just below the surface. "You're not going to hurt her, David. I won't let you." "Oh, I'm not going to hurt her," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm going to destroy her. Just like she destroyed me." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally lowered it, I looked at Jennifer. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with fear. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's not going to back down," I said, my jaw clenched. "He's going to try to ruin you, Jennifer. But we're not going to let him." We spent the next few hours contacting the police, explaining the situation, and filing a report. They took our concerns seriously, especially given David's unstable state, and promised to keep an eye on him. But even with their assurances, I knew this wasn't over. The next day, we received an email from David. It was a long, rambling message, filled with threats and accusations, but there was one part that stood out. A line that made my blood run cold: "Meet me where it all began. Let's settle this once and for all." He wanted a confrontation, a final showdown at the place where Jennifer and I had first discovered the truth, the hotel where she and David had met in secret. It was a twisted challenge, one I knew we couldn't ignore. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. I wasn't sure what David had planned, but I knew that if we didn't face him now, he would never stop. Jennifer wanted to come with me, but I refused to let her put herself in harm's way. This was something I needed to do alone. That evening, I drove to the hotel, my mind racing with 1,000 possible scenarios. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty, and the building loomed in the darkness like a ghost from my past. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin, and made my way toward the entrance. David was waiting for me in the lobby, sitting in one of the plush chairs, a drink in his hand. When he saw me, he smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Mike," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "I'm glad you came. I was starting to think you'd lost your nerve." I ignored the taunt and walked over to him, my eyes never leaving his. "This ends tonight, David. You're not going to hurt Jennifer anymore." He laughed, a cruel, bitter sound. "You think you can just walk away from this? That you can sweep it all under the rug and pretend it never happened? No, Mike. We're going to finish this, one way or another." I clenched my fists, ready for whatever he had planned. What do you want? He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. I want you to admit it, Mike. Admit that you're just like me. That deep down, you wanted this. Wanted to see her suffer, just like I did. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. But I didn't flinch. I'm nothing like you, David. Aren't you? He sneered. You set this whole thing in motion, Mike. You're the reason we're here. So don't pretend you're some kind of hero. You're just as broken as I am. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Maybe I was broken, I admitted. Maybe I did want to hurt you, to hurt her. But I'm not that person anymore. I'm done with revenge, David. It's time to move on. For a moment, David just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he set his drink down and stood up. You think you can just walk away from this? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Yes, I said, meeting his gaze. And so can you. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out, might try to make good on his threats. But then something in his eyes changed, a flicker of uncertainty, of doubt. He took a step back, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally caught up with him. Get out, he muttered, turning away from me. Just, get out. I didn't wait for him to change his mind. I turned and walked out of the hotel, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped into the cold night air, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, a sense that, for the first time in a long time, I was finally free. When I got back to my apartment, Jennifer was waiting for me, her eyes filled with worry. I told her everything that had happened, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It's over, I said, pulling her into a hug. We're free. As we stood there, holding each other, I knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where we could finally leave the past behind and start rebuilding our lives. And this time, I was determined to make it right. The morning after the confrontation with David, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in what felt like weeks. There was a sense of clarity in the air, as if the tension that had been building for months had finally dissipated. I woke up feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Jennifer and I sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee in comfortable silence. There was no need for words, we both knew that something fundamental had shifted the night before. The fear that had been gripping her, the anger that had consumed me, all of it seemed to fade in the light of a new day. We had faced our demons and, against all odds, we had come out on the other side. As we finished our coffee, Jennifer looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and something else, something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope, what now? She asked, her voice soft but steady. I set my mug down, thinking carefully before I answered. Now, we move on. We leave all of this behind and start fresh. She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. But how? How do we just move on after everything that's happened? I reached across the table and took her hand in mine, squeezing it gently. We take it one day at a time. We let go of the past and focus on what's ahead. It won't be easy, but we'll figure it out. She squeezed my hand back, and at that moment, I knew we were on the same page. The past had been a nightmare, but it was over. We had both made mistakes. Mistakes that had cost us dearly, but we had also learned from them. We had been through hell and back, and now it was time to start living again. Over the next few weeks, Jennifer and I worked together to rebuild our lives. We spent hours talking, not just about what had happened, but about what we wanted for the future. We made plans, small ones at first, like taking a trip out of town or finding new hobbies to enjoy together. Slowly but surely, we began to reclaim the joy that had been stolen from us. One evening, we decided to take a walk through the park near my apartment. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. As we walked, hand in hand, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. We reached a bench overlooking a small pond, and Jennifer suggested we sit for a while. As we sat there, watching the ducks glide across the water, she turned to me, her expression thoughtful. Do you ever think about what might have happened if things had been different? She asked. I considered her question for a moment before answering. Sometimes, but I've realized that dwelling on the what ifs doesn't change anything. We can't rewrite the past, but we can decide how we let it shape our future. She nodded, a smile playing on her lips. You've changed, Mike. You're stronger now, wiser. I smiled back at her, feeling a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. So have you. We've both been through a lot, but we're still here. And that means something. We sat in silence for a while, just enjoying the moment. The world felt calm, as if everything had finally fallen into place. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time, I felt ready to face them. I wasn't the same person I had been a year ago, and neither was Jennifer. We had been tested, and we had come out stronger on the other side. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, I turned to Jennifer, my heart full of gratitude and hope. "Let's make a promise," I said, my voice steady. "Let's promise to keep moving forward, no matter what. To keep building a life we can both be proud of." Jennifer looked into my eyes, her expression serious but filled with warmth. "I promise," she said softly. And with that, we stood up and began walking back to the apartment. Hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. We didn't know what the future held, but we knew one thing for sure: we were done looking back. The road ahead was ours to shape, and we were going to make the most of it, together. As we walked, the first stars began to appear in the sky, twinkling brightly against the deepening blue. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace, of contentment, knowing that the worst was behind us and that the future was ours to create.